Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of OK Talks. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in US domestic politics and also had the good fortune to have both traveled and lived in a number of countries outside of just my own. All of that combines puts me in a decent position to both shed some light for the folks back home on events of note going on in the rest of the world and interpret for my international audience just what the hell's going on in the politics of my own country, as I will today. So, two little elephants in the room before we get rolling here. First, yes, for those of you seeing the video version of this podcast on the YouTube channel, do not adjust your television sets. I do really have a mustache now. Leftover effects of a Halloween costume, but weirdly, I kind of don't hate it. Second, I know I said in the previous episode that it would be my last before the election, but a good friend who I believe listens to OK Talks and actually was my first guest on here asked what I thought a day and a half out, and I ended up sending him a giant audio message and I figured, why study for the final exams I have this week when I could instead make that giant message into a podcast episode to share my last-minute analysis with the audience for anybody out there who's absolutely freaking out in advance of what, sadly, yes, yet again, is the most important election of any of our lifetimes so far, unless, of course, anyone in my audience was old enough to have voted in 1860. I should say, for the record, I'm not making this to serve as what I believe the kids these days are calling hopium, nor am I think, doing my own version of that epic moment in 2012 when Megyn Kelly asked Karl Rove live on Fox if what he was presenting was, quote, math you do as a Republican to make yourself feel better. Now, those caveats aside, and for the record, if I'm wrong and we're all cowering in our bunkers later this week, please forgive me. I am feeling cautiously optimistic at the moment for a couple of reasons that I will briefly spell out here and what I hope to God will be one take so that I can go to study in the hopes of scraping a passing grade in my financial accounting exam tomorrow morning. Ugh. Finally, if you haven't already, even though I probably will be doing episodes a bit more sporadically these days, please do hit subscribe or follow the channel so you don't miss the next one that I do end up doing. Also, do me a favor and hit like and leave a comment, and most importantly, share this episode with anybody who you think could get something out of it. Thanks, as always, to anybody who already has. Thanks in advance to anybody else who will. So as I said, as of right now, midday local time, about 9 a.m. U.S. East Coast time, the Monday before the election, I am feeling cautiously optimistic. Now, I want to be clear. I do not have a crystal ball. I cannot see the future. I do not have insider information. I really might on some level just be coping rather than directly contemplating the emotional fallout that would occur if we suffer another night like November 8th, 2016. But based on my relatively informed analysis, here are the reasons why I am cautiously optimistic about at least the presidential election right now. So first is the fact that most of the swing state polls right now have the race virtually tied. Now, I know this is giving a lot of people heartburn, and I can see why. And obviously, I would rather that Kamala Harris were up by 5 in each of the swing state polls. But in a situation where the polls are basically tied, well, it's assumed that tie goes to the team with the better ground game, and that is definitely us. Yes, the Harris campaign got started late, but the Biden campaign before she took over already had a massive organizing operation in place, and the smooth handoff of the baton to Kamala Harris rather than some sort of messy mini primary meant that she just inherited that whole organizing operation, and her candidacy has also injected ungodly amounts of money into that operation, further strengthening it. On the other side of the ledger, the Trump campaign this year basically outsourced their entire ground game to two outside entities. One being this douchebag named Charlie Kirk, who, just as an aside, looks more like a bobblehead than any actual human being that I've ever seen. Huge head, tiny face. It's really weird. Right. So Charlie Kirk runs this sort of far-right, youth-focused organization called Turning Point USA. And then, in addition to Kirk, possibly even more weirdly, Trump's campaign has also outsourced their organizing effort to Elon Musk, which, okay. Musk's turnout operation has come with weird, gimmicky financial incentive schemes by Elon himself to try to basically buy people into registering to vote, which is probably illegal. And then also there have been a bunch of stories alleging like not very good treatment of the people Musk has hired to run this for him. Bottom line, if we subscribe to the theory that Joe Scarborough keeps positing that Ty goes to the team with a better ground game, well, one campaign has like an organizing juggernaut working to turn out every last vote. The other has Charlie and Elon doing whatever the fuck it is they're doing. So if reason number one for my cautious optimism is the ground game, reason number two has to do with where the national conversation and like the momentum is right now. So if you zoom out beyond the ground game and look at where the sort of momentum is at the moment, well, Harris is finishing the campaign strong with a pretty clear and compelling message, which is this: Trump has an enemies list, I have a to-do list. That is to say, he's here to try to solve his problems, I'm here to try and solve yours. The way I see it, the biggest vulnerability that Kamala Harris has in this election is her perceived tie to the sort of excesses of the obnoxious far left on certain cultural issues. I don't think that this is fair. I think she's getting tagged with that, unfortunately, for a couple of reasons. One, well, her first like real introduction to the American people outside of just California was the 2020 election, when she, like most Democratic primary candidates, except Joe Biden, who knew better, well, Harris, like most of the candidates in 2020, became way too enthralled to the like super woke online far lefts on Twitter. And in order to cater to that kind of primary voter, buried her main calling card, which is the fact that she was a kick-ass prosecutor who put a bunch of bad guys in jail. Another reason she's at risk of getting, again, I think, unfairly tagged with the, as President Obama called it, buzzkill far left label is, I think, frankly, probably grounded in a combination of racism, sexism, and regionalism. That is to say, the fact that Kamala Harris is a non-white woman from San Francisco probably makes her more vulnerable to being associated not just with like mainstream liberalism, but rather with the sort of like wokey mindset of the fringe left, which, I'm sorry, is just not broadly popular. Most Americans, as I sometimes say, view the TV show Portlandia as parody, not as inspiration. But there haven't been any stories in the news lately about, I don't know, about college students staging riots to protest the structurally biphobic imperialism of Taco Tuesday at the cafeteria or whatever. That is to say, the issue that I think, again, fair or not, is probably the biggest vulnerability for Harris has not actually been in the news lately, which is very much in her favor. Trump's main liabilities, on the other hand, are, off the top of my head, well, the fact that he only cares about himself and is also nuts and a racist and a fascist and doesn't respect women. And, well, I mean, think about what's made the news lately. All of the main news stories the last couple of days have played directly into Trump's weaknesses. I mean, think about it. Like, what have we had? I mean, besides his like endless airing of personal grievances at his rallies, like we've had this weird little Bund rally at Madison Square Garden where a featured speaker took a giant swipe at Latinos. We've had a bunch of high-level national security personnel, including Donald Trump's former chief of staff, General John Kelly, say, well, yeah, I worked in close proximity to this man, and he fits the dictionary definition of a fascist. And the only reason he's not goose-stepping down Pennsylvania Avenue right now is because he avoided the exercise by getting a doctor's note saying that his bone spurs mean that he can't wear the requisite jackboots. On women, like we've had this great, I'm going to protect the women of America whether they like it or not line, which, well, we all know the song. Girls just want to be protected by an adjudicated rapist, whether they like it or not. In the 2016 election, compared to this one, Trump had found a modicum of discipline in the last few weeks of the campaign, I mean, compared to his usual shtick, which allowed him to leave the focus of the last few weeks of that campaign not on his own vulnerabilities, but rather allow the media to, and the media and the jackass head of the FBI, to redirect attention of the last few weeks of the 2016 campaign to the Hillary Clinton email scandal. This year, Donald Trump can't go 45 minutes without musing about Liz Cheney getting shot, or members of the fake news getting shot, or for some reason, Hannibal Lecter. This is not a man who's massively in control of his faculties, okay? So If reason number one that I'm cautiously optimistic is the better ground game of the Harris campaign, reason number two is the momentum and where the conversation is right now. Reason number three is, and I should say, this is where I am most at risk of repeating Karl Rove's mistakes of 2012. I'm just having trouble trusting that much in where the polls are right now. And I think we need to kind of zoom out and like actually just question how seriously we should take the polls we're seeing to begin with. They've been massively wrong in both of the last two presidential elections, having substantially undercounted Trump's overall support. This has left pollsters rather chagrined for good reason, and well, a decent number of commentators have speculated that pollsters now might be inclined to actually overcount Trump's support to make sure that they don't fuck up in the same way they did in the last two presidential elections. Just about every single major election since 2020 has turned out more in favor of Democrats or like the liberal cause than was expected, because the polls had predicted a worse outcome for Democrats or for the liberal cause in every election since 2020. And remember that red wave that swept across the midterms, giving the Republicans a 40-seat majority in the House, 4 pickups in the Senate, and the governorships of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona? Yeah, neither do I. Also, there have been all these abortion referendums where the pro-choice side has won despite polling suggesting otherwise. Now, look, going too far down the rabbit hole of the polls are all wrong is usually a bad idea. So I really don't want to like project false optimism by just rejecting inconvenient polls, but I don't know. I have my doubts. You may have also seen that Ann Selzer, the sort of like queen of polling in Iowa specifically, someone who has predicted like basically every major election there correctly since 2008, just released a poll in which, unexpectedly, even to her, I've seen her interviewed about this a couple times, the poll that she released shows Harris up by 2 or like 2 or 3 in Iowa, where Democrats aren't even competing this year. And now maybe this poll is an outlier. Maybe it's bullshit. Maybe it's hopium. But it could also indicate that either there's a last minute shift to Harris, and yes, to be fair, a sub reason why I'm cautiously optimistic right now has been that polls have been showing that late deciders are breaking for Harris. But the poll in Iowa could also indicate that the polls this cycle have just been sort of missing the target. It's just hard for me to imagine that Donald Trump will get a lot of voters in the 2024 election that he didn't get in 2020. I mean, what has Trump offered to voters who did not vote for him in 2020, who might vote for him now? What has he offered voters since 2020 besides a failed coup attempt and like a bunch of personal legal problems? The one area where it looks like Trump will have growth this year is in this weird sort of like incel manosphere, like men's rights activist space. And to me, this does signal something that I've thought for a while, which is that Democrats need to do a better job of talking to men, especially younger men, in a way that doesn't come across as super condescending. We need to maybe be at least a little bit more careful about how much we put the word toxic next to the word masculinity. Because I think that some of the way that we've talked about the need for gender equality has caused some subset of young men to think that gender equality means blaming them for the sins of their forefathers and then tearing them down, rather than lifting men and women up together. And a lot of like lonely younger men who feel that way, rightly or wrongly, I would argue wrongly, have fallen into this sort of like manosphere, men's rights activist influencer space and become prey to deeply, yes, toxic creeps like Andrew Tate. In the longer term, as I say, this is something that I think Democrats need to work on. Also, yes, there has been slippage for the Democrats in terms of their dominance, our dominance among Black and Latino men, not just white ones. And this, again, I think speaks to a longer-term need for the Democrats to recalibrate our approach both to how we address men and to our reflexive assumption that ethnicity-based identity politics are often a good way to segment the voting population rather than focusing more on, say, education or socioeconomic class. But in the short term, those are long-term problems that the Democrats need to tackle. But in the short term, well, I can't see a last week before the election focused on guests at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally kicking the shit out of Latinos in his stand-up routine being a big help to Trump among Latino men. Also, in the shorter term, this is actually sort of the fourth reason that I'm feeling cautiously optimistic right now. If the first three reasons were the better ground game, the where the momentum is right now, and my not being entirely certain that I completely trust where the polls are. The fourth reason that I'm feeling cautiously optimistic right now, is the Trump campaign putting a bunch of resources into recruiting young men. Like that does not scare me that much for two reasons. One, because the way and the extent to which the Trump campaign has sort of leaned in on this, as Nikki Haley hinted at the other day, creeps out women who are more likely to actually vote and were already more inclined to vote Democrat even before Trump, enabled the demolition of the half-century constitutional precedent protecting the national right to have an abortion in the United States. And secondly, because young men do not tend to be high-propensity voters. And frankly, I think a lot of these folks that Trump has tried to target that way are just not going to show up. For a long time, the Democratic coalition has been bigger than the Republican coalition, but has depended a lot more on low propensity voters, younger, working class, while the Republicans' linchpin was like college educated suburbanites who tend to be quite high propensity voters. But Donald Trump has driven those people out of the Republican Party. We thought that we were just renting those voters in our big midterm wins back in 2018, but like the fact that Trump has continued to dominate the Republican Party and like turn it into this sort of like weird isolationist, authoritarian, unprofessional, tariffs are my only economic policy personality cult does not appeal to a lot of the like high propensity voters who used to be like Mitt Romney Republicans. The stereotypical soccer mom, like moderate Republican voter, probably does not want her daughters growing up in a country where they have fewer rights than she did at her age, and her sons growing up under a president who is basically a poster child for every behavior that we were taught was bad in kindergarten. A president whose mere presence in the Oval Office on some level says to her teenage son, if you're a star, they let you do it. I don't know. I could most definitely be wrong. And of course, we need to recognize that no matter what happens on election day, Donald Trump is going to come out an hour after the polls close and say some form of, I won this historic election bigly, okay, tremendously. They should stop counting ballots. Every ballot that they count now is fake and rigged by the radical Democrat Party. It's a scam, okay? It's a scam. They're trying to steal it from you just like they did in 2020, okay? So just, assume that will be a thing like Kamala Harris could win by 20 million votes. Donald Trump is still going to do that on election night. So just assume that will happen regardless of the outcome, especially if, as I suspect, it looks like Trump is initially ahead in Pennsylvania, probably the most important swing state in the country at this point, at the end of election night, because the law in that state, if I'm remembering correctly, mandates counting votes that are cast on election day before they even start looking at ballots that were cast in early or absentee votes, which, and considering the fact that same day votes, at least in 2020, favored Trump, whereas votes that were mailed in or voted early were more likely to favor the Democrats, resulted in the perception that Trump was way ahead in Pennsylvania when over time the vote shifted away from him. But his claiming that this represented some sort of fraud, they found a bunch of ballots from China or Pennsylvania or Hugo Chavez or whatever the fuck. It's the same trick that he pulled in 2020. And, if at first you don't succeed, like I say, he's almost guaranteed to try that again this year. As I've been saying, I am feeling cautiously optimistic about where things will land when all of the votes are actually counted. But as I've also been saying, I could be wrong. And if you were thinking, well, I was going to spend election day helping to drive voters to the polls, but now that I know Oliver is cautiously optimistic, I think I'll crack open a few beers and watch the new season of The Rings of Power. Please revert to plan A. This is an all hands on deck sort of situation. The stakes are higher than they've been at any point in our lifetimes. But also, don't give in to what I described in the last episode of OK Talks, which you should definitely go listen to if you haven't already. Do not give in to the fear that Donald Trump is working tirelessly to spread. Don't throw in the towel like Jeff fucking Bezos. Until the very last second of this thing is over, ask yourself, what else could I do to help keep Donald Trump's grubby little fingers off the nuclear codes? And then go do that thing. All right, that's it for this, definitely the last pre-election episode of OK Talks. If you like the show and want to make sure not to miss the next episode, whenever that is, and again, please do bear with me as I'm likely to be a bit more sporadic for a while, be sure to subscribe to the show or follow the channel or whatever it's called wherever you're consuming this. If you really want to do me a solid, please hit like, leave a comment, and most importantly, share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks as always to those who already have. Thanks in advance to anybody else who will. Thanks to my friend Nate Wright for having designed the podcast artwork, and to everyone else for listening.